guys, Jasmine here, coming at you with another Biggest Losers of the Bible. And much like the rest of our series, the people who we admire so much in the Bible had really crazy challenges of their own, whether it was something that they experienced politically in the environment that they were living in, whether it was a personal issue with their own family or career path, the choices that they make or choices someone else made for them. These characters in the Bible were real people. Today we are going to talk about a particularly interesting situation. It's a shame that we don't actually know more about him and his life, because the instructions directly from the Lord makes their experience so much more challenging. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Book of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem in the latter half of Israel's kingdom period, and he spoke on God's behalf to the leaders of Jerusalem and Judah.
The book bearing his name is made up of 66 books, the same as our Bible is 66 books. Most people read the book but don't really understand who the man is.
We know that Isaiah lived in Jerusalem. We know that his father's name was Amoz, but we have no idea who that is.
Isaiah 1:1, 2:1, 6:1, 7:3, 13:1. He is described as the son of Amoz, not Amos the prophet.
It is probable that Isaiah was a member of the royal family because of his easy access to the kings.
Some scholars suggest Amoz was the uncle of Uzziah, which, if true, would make Isaiah the king's cousin.
He lived during the period between 739 BC and 701 BC, a 40-year period of tremendous upheaval.
So Isaiah's message is primarily directed to Judah and Jerusalem after the nation was divided in two during the reigns of 4 kings. The book opens by inviting us to interpret its message during the reigns of these kings. So part of Isaiah's time was prophesying during a prosperous time. Following this, King Ahaz and King Hezekiah of Judah faced a number of threats from surrounding nations, including Assyria. The first crises took place when Aram and Israel, which were nations to the north of Judah, they formed a coalition to come against Judah around the time of 735 BC. God came to the relief of Judah by bringing Assyria against Aram and Israel, which caused Aram and Israel to flee and release from Judah. The second major crisis relates to the Assyrian Empire, again on the rise in the middle of the 8th century under a king called Tiglath-Pileser III. Assyria had numerous campaigns which stretched into Israel, but also into Judah. In Sennacherib's own annals, he refers to having taken 46 cities of Judah during this campaign. There's a third crisis that arises during the era of the Babylonian Empire. In Isaiah 39, Isaiah the prophet announces that Jerusalem and its king would be taken into captivity by Babylon, who would rise in the future as the new empire after Assyria.
We know a lot about the lives of the prophets who didn't write books, like Elijah and Elisha, and we know relatively little about the lives of the ones who did write books. That's true for Isaiah too.
A prophet of Judah, Isaiah, ministered during the reign of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahab, and Hezekiah, the kings of Judah. So right off the bat, we know that Isaiah wasn't a no-namer. He definitely came up in a family well-known and of education. So let's go on. His wife was a prophetess. In Isaiah 8:3, he said, "Then I made love to the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son." Isaiah 8:3 tells us that story. Isaiah's original call to service is unrecorded, but we have his vision and commission.
God commands a prophet to do something that is seemingly unthinkable. Go and loosen the sackcloth from your hips, take your shoes off your feet. And he did so, going naked and barefoot. And the Lord said, even as my servant Isaiah has gone naked and barefoot 3 years as a sign and token against Egypt and Cush, so the king of Assyria will lead away the captives of Egypt and the exiles of Cush, young and old, naked, barefoot, with buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. Then they will be dismayed and ashamed because of Cush, their hope, and Egypt, their boast. He has him stripped down as a sign to the nations in order to convey his message of salvation and of judgment. We are to look to the nation Israel in order for us to be warned, that we would not crave the same things that they crave, that we would not make the same mistakes that Israel made. What you're looking at here is a coalition of nations, Egypt, Ethiopia, and in their attempt, they're trying to drag Israel in on that, to form a coalition against Assyria that is threatening to invade them. God, look at verse 1 again. In the year that the commander came to Ashdod, when Sargon, the king of Assyria, sent him and fought against Ashdod and captured it, at that time the Lord spoke through Isaiah. And so what's going on here is that the Philistine city of Ashdod is getting ready to be captured. Well, Ashdod was just west of Jerusalem. It symbolized a land bridge, and that land bridge, should it fall, would open up the floodgates for Assyria to come down not only into Jerusalem, but into Egypt and into Ethiopia. It was the gateway. So if Ashdod falls, the world is in trouble. Commentators point out that the king of Ashdod, Yamini, fled to Egypt, even as Assyria is going down to overthrow it. And as he goes to Egypt for asylum, for refuge, Egypt turns on the king of Ashdod, and he surrenders the king into the hands of Assyria. Now imagine the image there. The image being that the only thing that was withholding Assyria from overcoming the whole region, the king is now being carried off into Assyria in shackles. What a terrifying little bit of news. I mean, that would be like breaking news on Fox News, right? The king of Assyria is taken captive and heading off to enemy territory. What a warning it is to the entire region. It's not because these nations don't actually have the capability of providing protection. They can, and maybe that would be a good thing. Maybe families would be saved. Maybe lives would be spared. Wherever these nations come from, there's one thing that's consistent. They worship a false God. If Judah were to be wise, they would remember that failure to trust God in every circumstance is a major mistake. As we think of all of the hostile forces in the world around us, what's the key? The key to this is faith. Will Judah, by faith, take heed to the warnings and to the promises of God? And the Lord said, even as my servant Isaiah has gone naked and barefoot 3 years as a sign and token against Egypt and Cush, so the king of Assyria will lead away the captives of Egypt and the exiles of Cush, young and old, naked, barefoot, with buttocks uncovered. I remember struggling through the book of Hosea and the commentaries because what God asked Hosea to act out was mind-bending. He tells the prophet Hosea, go and acquire for yourself a wife of harlotry and bear children of harlotry. Ezekiel is another example. If you look at Ezekiel chapter 4, God commands Ezekiel to lay for months on his side. First on his right side, and then on his left side. He is bearing the iniquity of the people. Strange, isn't it? In Ezekiel chapter 12, Ezekiel is told that he is to carry around with him a burdensome amount of luggage. And he was even told to go in specific times of the day and parade in front of the city and let people see you trying to drag this baggage around. That entire passage is showing that in the same way, the people will be dragged off with their luggage and their possessions into Babylon. There's a practical lesson for us here, obviously, because if we look at Isaiah and what God asked him to do, we should ask ourselves, are we willing to pay the price? Are we willing to act out the message of the gospel, the message of salvation and judgment? Because that's what he's doing. Alec Motter says in his commentary, come what may, Isaiah paid the price of obedience by embodying the word that was given to him. Are we willing, in the eyes of the world, to look like fools? 1 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, the word of the cross is foolishness to those that are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. And there's your choices, brothers and sisters. Either the gospel is going to be folly or the gospel is going to be power.
And so the book of Isaiah ends with the very grand vision of the fulfillment of all of God's covenant promises. Through the suffering servant king, God creates a covenant family of all nations who are awaiting the hope of God's justice in bringing a renewed creation, where God's kingdom finally comes here on earth as it is in heaven. And that's the very powerful hope of the book of Isaiah.
That is all I have for us this time. I hope that you got some coffee. I hope that you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Let me know what you think. And can't wait to see where it takes us next time. Bye, guys.